Morena, kia ora, kia orana, Isabula Vanaka, Talofa, Maloelele, kia orana. Welcome everybody to our session on environmental human rights defenders in the Pacific region, working to strengthen support and protections for our environmental human rights defenders. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming to our session today. I'd like to start off, first of all, obviously, by acknowledging the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights for facilitating this meeting for this very important topic. And I'd like to thank also our speakers who are going to be joining us today. We have an excellent lineup of experts on the issue to listen to today. Okay, so without further ado, we'll get into it. I'll be having a few opening remarks, and then I'm going to be introducing our speakers today, and then we're going to have a question and answer session after that. So let's get started. My name is Tina Ngata, and I'm very thankful for being asked to moderate our session today. I'm a Ngāti Porou Wahine. My mountain is Hikurangi, my river is Waiapu, and I stay on the East Cape of the North Island, whose proper name is Te Ika a Maui, in what is now known as Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I work as an environmental and human rights defender for my people of Ngāti Porou and Te Whānau Atu Whakiiri Ora. Lovely to be with you all today. Now, when we're discussing issues, and in today's workshop is with a specific lens towards Indigenous peoples and women in the Pacific region. And I want to have a word first about what it is to be Indigenous. Often when we talk about being Indigenous, it gets captured in a particular political sense. But we know also that there are broader understandings of what it is to be Indigenous, which includes a way of living and knowing and being and doing and relating to each other that grows up out of the soils and up out of the waters and is carried by the people of those soils and of those waters as a long-standing relationship. And so particularly for us as Indigenous ocean peoples in the Pacific region, we hold this long-standing relationship and ways of knowing and being and doing that come out of the waters and are carried in the waters in our body and through our relationships. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Mereoni Chung, who is the associate for Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, Dawn. Mereoni is a Fijian feminist activist. She is an associate with the Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era with a keen focus on political ecology and sustainability. Mereoni is an advocate of women's rights and works with local civil society organizations in Fiji, with Pacific collectives and across the global south with her feminist networks to mobilize action for gender equality and social justice. Presently, she is working with Pacific civil society collectives to progress critiques and alternative perspectives on global and regional development concerns and issues such as the blue economy. Mereoni is born, raised, and lives in Fiji and holds a master's in applied anthropology and in applied anthropology. So tēnā koe Mereoni, welcome. I cede the stage to you. Kia ora.
Yes, thank you, Tina. Bula, everybody. Good morning. I'm very glad to be here to share some experiences as a woman human rights defender. Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Tina. I will just very quickly introduce my organization before I go into sharing some of my insights. So as mentioned, yeah, I am an associate with Dawn. It stands for Development Alternatives with Women in a New Era. And we are a global South feminist network of activists and scholars and scholar activists who research and analyze and publish critiques and alternative perspectives on global as well as regional development concerns and issues. We collaborate with international partners like Social Watch and regional partners like the Pacific Network on Globalization, and we advocate for the protection and the advancement of women's rights. Dawn also engages in social mobilizing with like-minded feminists and development organizations, and we provide support for shadow reporting in the Global South, our Global South networks on CEDAW and the Committee on, and reporting to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights at the UN Human Rights Council. Today I've been asked to offer up some insights on lenses of women environmental human rights defenders. And I will do this by speaking from my experiences and sharing on our efforts to raise flags and spotlight concerns for the ocean environment, specifically challenging the blue washing of our Pacific development experiences by corporate-driven resource exploitation interests. In terms of lenses, our approach has always been to maintain and apply a Global South feminist lenses to our analysis and advocacy. It's about decolonizing knowledge, being aware of the power imbalances, and centering women and other marginalized groups that would otherwise be invisible in their experiences because some knowledge and interests are privileged over others. For me, it's about creating a critical voice as a Pacific Island woman of what's going on around me and acting upon it. For instance, and to a large extent, when I hear the terms blue economy, I recognize immediately intentions of economic, political, and social interests playing out in the Pacific Ocean. We see a growing and evolving development framework imposed on, under, and through our waters, and I wonder what the implications are for the ocean environment, for us now and for the future. We may be people of the ocean, like Tina had said, but the blue economy framing is a new way of relating to the ocean around us. So we at Dawn, we want to interrogate blue economy conceptualizations and definitions from a Global South perspective. You see, because as a Pacific feminist, I want to know and I want to assess its economic, ecological, and gender justice implications. I want to know what will be the impacts for Pacific women's livelihoods, those of us who depend on a healthy ocean for our sustenance and shared identity and our relationships. I want to ask whether an intensification of ocean industries will bring about gender equality, and how so? Will more markets for our fish and pearls mean more gender equality? Will it improve the working conditions of fisher women? Will it remove the exploitation of Pacific Ocean labor and reduce violence against women and girls? Will it relieve the burden of poverty on our countries and for coastal communities? Will the blue economy development framework reduce the risk to our environment's integrity? Firstly, the language of economy attached to blue already signals to me the economic over the social, marginalizing the importance of culture, traditional systems and knowledge, environment and rights of nature. Furthermore, submerged within the language of blue economy are very different sectors and industries. Tourism is in there, coastal and deep fisheries, aquaculture and ocean transportation, but also seabed mining and deep sea mining, pharmaceuticals, bioprospecting, and the energy industry, the high-risk extractives. We need to distinguish sources and sites of Pacific livelihoods from other sectors like DSM and big states' geopolitical interests in my region that are at play within the blue economy paradigm. We must challenge the scope of the blue economy so that the cost of some sectors like mining extractives on the environment do not undermine the real sustainability of other ocean sectors like tourism and fisheries. There may be some goodies in there, but there are some real baddies, and we can't risk everything just by giving a blue pass. Deep sea mining, currently advancing in the Pacific Ocean, is one of the core concerns in our critical research and advocacy and mobilizing that Dawn is part of. We do this work in collaboration with many Pacific CSOs and other Global South movements. While our oceans are the blue heart of our planet, it is under threat from pollution, plastic waste, nuclear waste. Japan announced this year their interest to dump nuclear water waste into the Pacific Ocean. The ocean biodiversity is under threat and from biodiversity destruction and overfishing. The effects of climate change we know so well, including oceans warming, sea level rise, and ocean acidification, continue to disproportionately impact Pacific people. Yet there are mining companies, commercial mining companies, mainly from the global north, pushing our Pacific governments to sponsor their deep sea mining activities for economic blue benefits within our Pacific EEZ and areas beyond national jurisdictions in international waters. Such agreements happen away from our purview, behind closed doors, on an international stage somewhere, at a technical committee of some sort. When it comes to us, it's in some sort of blue format, some kind of blue policy, or blue conditioned financial instrument. And if we don't ask questions and challenge the processes and demand the information that evades us, before the decisions get made about us, they will take our oceans from right in front of us for corporate profits. One of the loud arguments in favor of deep sea mining is that it is critical for achieving a sustainable world, specifically green technologies. For me, I see the climate justice narrative being co-opted here and used to justify the rush to mine the ocean floor for precious metals for sustainable technologies. This is too ironic, and Pacific women are calling it out. We have to call on our leaders because there is no way that the Pacific can be, on one hand, the moral champions of climate justice, and then on the other hand, becoming one of the largest sponsors of environmental destruction through deep sea mining activities in our waters. We need to seriously talk about the contradictions in our moral standing for sustainable development in the Pacific. Indigenous communities in the Pacific have been adamant that deep sea mining and seabed mining should not go ahead. And this has support from conservationists, NGOs, our churches, scientific communities, and legal experts from the region and globally. Fiji has announced a moratorium on DSM. This is supported by Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea in 2019. In New Zealand, there's a proposed bill to ban seabed mining in their waters. We need to join together and join this momentum to call out for the straight out ban of deep sea mining, not just in the Pacific, but globally. We have to protect our oceans now more urgently than ever, not just for the Pacific, but the entire planet. And we urge you to join. I welcome you to join the Pacific Collective Statement titled Join the Blue Line, the Blue Pacific Line, and sign on to the call to ban deep sea mining. My final statement, and to close, I want to share a reflection from one of my colleagues at Dawn, by Gita Sen. She says, oceans should be as great a global concern as climate and climate change is. They are both the commons, which are not easy to manage and certainly not private, both in the ways which they exist and the ways in which they impact people. The concern is also for the significant and largely harmful impacts on the livelihoods of vulnerable people, particularly in the context of the Global South. Given the complexities of these concerns, critical spaces are needed not only in terms of understanding, but also in terms of civil society action for advocacy and mobilization. Vinaka, and thank you, Tina.
Tēnā koe Mereoni, what a powerful statement you've provided today. Thank you so much. And yes, we always have to remember that, you know, our moana in particular, our shared moana of the Pacific is one of the two lungs of the planet, the other being the Amazon forest. And so we have to protect, for the good of the planet, we have to protect our moana region. But we also know that the best form of protection is when the people of that place are centered in the response, and the people of the Pacific have been clear, overwhelmingly clear, that, and undeniably clear, that deep sea mining has no part in that future for us. I'd like to bring to the floor our next speaker, who is Catherine Murupaenga-Ikenn. Catherine hails from the Ngāti Porou and Te Rarawa peoples of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and has over the years been involved in environmental defence and social justice campaigns. She has been a policy and technical advisor to her tribal councils on matters including climate change, social justice, environmental protection, constitutional transformation, and engagement with the UN human rights system in her project management and negotiator roles. Catherine helped achieve land claim settlements for both her peoples in with the New Zealand government, and she holds a Bachelor of Laws in Social Science and a Master of Laws, and was awarded, excuse me, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Indigenous Fellow, representing the Pacific in 2005. Prior to her current position as the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights Senior Indigenous and Minorities Fellow at the Regional Pacific, at the Regional Office for the Pacific, she tutored in the Business Department for Northland Polytech. Catherine, kei koe te turu, kia ora.
Tēnā koe te tuakanei tina, kia ora, Bulavanaka, all, and I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to share highlights from our Pacific Regional Office's engagement with women and Indigenous environmental human rights defenders in the Pacific. And I'd also like to start by acknowledging all Indigenous human rights defenders in the Pacific, including environmental human rights defenders, recognizing that the right to a clean and healthy environment is a prerequisite for the right to life and other human rights. And similarly, I especially want to pay tribute to our women defenders, recognizing the added gender dynamics they courageously face every day. Our regional office conducted a scoping mission on women environmental human rights defenders, with results which we look forward to presenting in the near future. And from the findings my colleagues are compiling, a strong theme is emerging of women human rights defenders as critical agents for change in their communities, despite the fact that they often go unrecognized for their work. As educators and mentors, they raise awareness on violence, gender equality, and human rights. As responders, they protect women and extract them from situations of violence. As advocates, they influence community-level decision-making. And as activists, they take public action and they monitor and report violations. Our office's scoping mission also confirmed many challenges for our women human rights defenders. They're often subjected to stigmatization, exclusion, and ostracization by community leaders, faith-based groups, families, and communities who consider them to be threatening religion, honor, or culture through their work. Concerns of ill treatment and threats of violence against them are common, including the risks of attacks in the private sphere and against their families and loved ones. Many are engaged in their human rights defenders work on a voluntary basis and in addition to their family, professional or employment related roles and responsibilities. Frequently, women human rights defenders lack access to helpful information, to justice, and to equal protection under the law, especially in rural or remote settings. They lack common platforms for the expression of solidarity and just to be in a safe space, while at the same time experiencing high rates of cyberbullying. They find it difficult to obtain financial, administrative, and other resources needed to be effective in their defence work. And a second event that our office was involved in was in April, where we hosted a Pacific Indigenous Peoples and Climate Crisis Workshop, which reinforced many overlapping issues in common with our women human rights defenders. And we were also privileged to hear the experiences and insights of Indigenous environmental human rights defenders, NGOs, academic, national human rights institutions, and other human rights advocates raising different frontline issues. And from the needs identified in discussions at that workshop, there are many actions which might be recommended in an environmental protection context and in terms of supporting the work of Indigenous and women environmental human rights defenders. Firstly, obviously, we must end pollution and overuse of natural resources in the Pacific and address increasingly overpopulated areas which are exacerbating resource scarcity, all of which, in addition to climate crisis pressures, is making the situation of Indigenous peoples, women, and others in the region more vulnerable, and is threatening migration from communities to urban areas, creating new social problems. Secondly, we must protect the Pacific Oceans as a critical buffer against global heating, and this was discussed by our earlier speakers, and because the oceans are vital for the well-being of Indigenous peoples and women who rely on them for subsistence. Therefore, UN entities like UN Oceans, the International Seabed Authority, and the International Maritime Organization need to recognize and protect Indigenous peoples' rights in this regard. Thirdly, to ensure that resilience building solutions are tailored to specific communities' ecological and environmental profiles and their spiritual and physical needs, and that they ensure more inclusion of women and environmental human rights defenders in decision-making, ensure Indigenous knowledge protection, and respect free, prior, and informed consent. Also, these solutions must be supported through better alignment and collaboration among and between national and international agencies whose objectives sometimes conflict with one another, and through more effective partnering with impacted local communities, NGOs, and governments. This involves increasing governments and civil society's awareness of Indigenous peoples' human rights and governments' obligations to actively protect those rights. For Pacific Indigenous peoples, we must unify more on shared concerns, including to increase support for Indigenous peoples, especially women and youth, to engage with their national human rights institutions, domestic justice systems, and the United Nations system of human rights protection mechanisms, including the International Court. And of note recently is the growing number of legal cases taken against states and corporations for conduct which allegedly violates human rights connected with worsening greenhouse gas emissions and climate crisis, environmental decline, violation of the right to life, ensuring a livable world for future generations, and other issues. Next, to provide meaningful education about environmental human rights and defenders in the education system. Further, to be cautious about technologies that may cause ecological or social harm, and Mereoni just spoke about deep sea mining, but one that came up in the workshop on Indigenous peoples and climate crisis was climate engineering, and a recommendation there might be for field testing or implementation of that technology to be halted, so to call for a moratorium, which should be imposed into more transparency and effective regulatory and enforcement governance is in place. And of course, the principle of free, prior and informed consent is respected. Instead, there should be more nature-based solutions to restore ecologies and mitigate and adapt to climate crisis, with Indigenous peoples' full participation in their design and implementation. To stop Indigenous peoples' lands, territories and resources being excessively exploited, we must halt such courses of action in the name of conservation, especially in the context of climate crisis mitigation and adaptation. And finally, there are a number of links with the economic operating system itself, which must be addressed to mitigate or avoid adverse environmental impacts. First, to recognise that climate crisis relating to climate, ecology, food and water, socio-economic inequality and the failed capitalistic economies, these are all converging because they are all connected. Therefore, it must be recognised that environmental human rights defenders' efforts have a much wider beneficial impact beyond just the environment, and this makes their work all the more critical. Governments must carefully understand the risks of low carbon economic development and green or climate finance for that development, being discussed under the UN Convention on Climate Change. And lastly, for businesses to do comprehensive due diligence on their environmental, carbon and social footprint, including the impact on Indigenous peoples. Rather than relying on voluntary business action with government support, states should go one better and make business due diligence mandatory, but governments should also lead the way by implementing their own national plan of action for business and human rights. So those are just some of the recommendations that could possibly be formed out of the engagement that our office has had with Indigenous peoples and human rights defenders. So I will end there and hand back to you, Tina. Thank you very much once again. Kia ora.
Tēnā anō koe te tuakana, Catherine. Thank you very much. There was a comprehensive overview of the situation of environmental human rights defenders with specific focus towards the impacts of women in our region, upon women and youth and children in our region, with some clear recommendations as well, which we love to see, and just really want to acknowledge the work that the office have done and that you have done around this and bringing these things to light and to attention. I particularly, it really resonated with me what you had said. Obviously, as a really isolated environmental human rights defender myself, I absolutely appreciated the focus that you placed upon the way in which this impacts upon our relationships at the community level as well. Thank you very much for, again, another powerful discussion that you've opened up for us today, Catherine. So I'd like to welcome to the floor next Roshika Deo. Roshika is a feminist, a Pacific human rights defender, within the Pacific Human Rights Defenders Network. Roshika is the outgoing chairperson of the Pacific Human Rights Defenders Network, which was established 3 years ago to promote the protection of human rights and to ensure the collective protection and empowerment of human rights defenders in the Pacific region, with a special emphasis on women human rights defenders and gender non-conforming human rights defenders. Roshika has been working in the development sector in Fiji in the Pacific and beyond for over 12 years. She has a law degree and a master's in political science from the University College of London. I cede the floor to you, Roshika. Tēnā koe.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Vinaka Tina. So Bula Vinaka, everyone. I'm going to focus in my presentation, I'm going to focus on the status of women environmental human rights defenders in the region. This is from a lot of the work that has been done through feminist collectives in the last several years, through OHCHR and also through Amnesty International. In our region, we have women environmental human rights defenders from all diversities, as we've been hearing from the previous speakers. We have Indigenous women, young women, minority ethnic group women, women with diverse gender identities and sexual orientation, and also women with disabilities. These women environmental human rights defenders are defending the land and ocean ecosystems against the adverse effects of climate change. They're also advocating government for stronger environmental protection measures and also holding corporates accountable for human rights abuse. In our region, we also have entrenched patriarchal, paternalistic and heteronormative cultures, making it difficult and dangerous in many of our Pacific Island countries for women, let alone adolescent girls and young women, to be at the forefront of environmental protection and to be meaningfully engaged in decision-making spaces. The patriarchal dominance that we see in decision-making and governance, the specific vulnerabilities and needs, and the gender division of labor, among other country-specific factors, can lead to women environmental human rights defenders being invisibilized and excluded from decision-making spaces in many of our countries. Furthermore, more often than not, we tend to think of environmental concerns quite separately from human rights and gender, which further aggravates the vulnerabilities that women environmental human rights defenders face. They face, personal security risk, such as assault, criminalization, intimidation, and sexual violence. They also face threats to their freedom of expression, assembly, association, and political participation. Women environmental human rights defenders face human rights risk, including risk to their livelihoods, by speaking out against and challenging businesses who hold considerable economic and political power and whose business activities have adverse social and environmental impacts. This could be either through large-scale development projects, through the extractive resource sector, or through agribusiness activities. One of the most urgent aspects of the relationship between human rights and the environment are for the need to recognize and protect women environmental human rights defenders. So this enables the participation in decision-making spaces, and also because without whom the protection of the environment and of the rights that we all depend upon would be impossible. However, the vulnerabilities, the threats and immense risk that are present to the lives and well-being of women environmental human rights defenders in our region still remain a heavily camouflaged issue. To share an example from Cressida Kuala, who is a woman human rights defender and an environmental activist from Enga province in PNG, quote, "Mining company employees are raping, abusing, torturing and killing Indigenous men, women, and young women from the most affected areas of the Porgera gold mine," unquote. She shared that women are beaten and taken to jail if they refuse to have sex with the employees of the mining company. Women are gang raped by male employees of the mining company. There are forced evictions and arson. Police brutality is rife, causing permanent disabilities or death. She says the legal system and government has failed her and other human rights defenders who raise this human rights violation. This context, combined with tribal conflicts, which are aggravated by the mining activities, results in Cressida constantly fleeing places looking for safety with her children. The lack of legal protection and access to justice, the large-scale impunity and corruption, including the high rates of gender-based violence, all this combined creates an unsafe space for her to engage in decision-making and to safely continue advocating for environmental protection and the rights of her people in Porgera. And as shocking as these accounts may be, this still does not fully convey the scale and nature of the challenges and risks that are faced by environmental human rights defenders, especially women environmental human rights defenders in our region. Our high prevalence rates of violence against women and girls, gender-based violence, these are used to suppress women environmental human rights defenders. to suppress their power and authority, to undermine their credibility, and to dismantle their status within the community and discourage them and others from coming forward and participating in various spaces on environmental protection and rights. Repressive laws limit the ability to work, and broad and ambiguous legal provisions in many of our countries are used to prosecute environmental human rights defenders. Furthermore, violations of the right to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly are common because laws provide wide powers to the government to restrict these rights. Moreover, we have a tendency to think about environmental rights and protection separately from climate crisis and action. So on one hand, we may have spaces for climate action, but these spaces can be hostile to discussing the linkages with extractive resource industries, with deforestation, with large-scale development projects, and so on. So how will women environmental human rights defenders be able to safely and fully continue working on human rights issues related to environmental justice, related to land rights and access to control over natural resources? How will they meaningfully participate in decision-making spaces in our Pacific region? Through the work done with a lot of the women environmental human rights defenders in the region over the years, some of the things that have come that urgently needs to be undertaken to protect and promote the rights of environmental human rights defenders, including women environmental human rights defenders, are, the first thing actually is, no countries in the Pacific has specific laws that are designed to protect the rights of human rights defenders. Moreover, the work of human rights defenders is not seen as legitimate by some governments. Rather, it is perceived as threatening. Then there is the lack of systematic data on the status of human rights defenders and the risk they face. Pacific Island governments should adopt the principles that are set out in the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders and take immediate steps to protect and promote the rights of human rights defenders. In particular, Pacific Island governments should protect human rights defenders from harassment, threats, violence, intimidation, censorship, and abusive prosecutions. The other thing that I want to highlight is that as a region, we have not been able to deal with the adverse human rights impact of business activities, especially on women environmental human rights defenders. Pacific governments should, in equal collaboration with women environmental human rights defenders, develop national action plans to implement the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The UN guiding principles provides the responsibility of all business entities to safeguard the rights of human rights defenders, and it stipulates businesses to consult human rights defenders as an important expert resource as part of the human rights due diligence. We need to create greater awareness on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and lobby our governments to develop national action plans to implement it, but with the inclusion, with the equal and meaningful inclusion of women environmental human rights defenders. The other thing that I wanted to highlight was that a lot of our Pacific Island governments should review the existing laws and policies and practices in order to change or repeal those that unduly restrict the work of human rights defenders and to enable their legitimate activities in promoting and defending human rights. In many of our Pacific Island countries, we still have laws that is shrinking the civic society spaces, that is also limiting the rights of human rights defenders to do the work that they do. Finally, the other thing that I wanted to emphasize on is the role of regional intergovernmental bodies, such as the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. They should recognize the precarious status of human rights defenders in the region, the precarious status of women environmental human rights defenders in our region, and incorporate the goal of protecting and promoting human rights defenders into their meeting agendas, including at Pacific Leaders Meeting. As you can see, there's many things that needs to be done to improve the status of environmental human rights defenders in our region. However, the specific experiences of women environmental human rights defenders are little understood in our region. And as mentioned, more needs to be done and urgently to protect their rights and them. So I'll conclude my presentation here, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to discuss a bit more of this during the question and answers. Vinaka, everyone. Thank you, Tina.
Tēnā koe, thank you very much, Roshika. That was a very sobering, sobering and important intervention that you provided for us this morning. I also wanted to thank you, Roshika, and for the breadth of your presentation, but also for the work that your organization does with gender diverse and gender non-conforming activists as well. And it would be remiss for us to go any further without acknowledging the killing of our Tongan human rights activist Fepulea'i Kefu early May. I wanted to acknowledge Poli's family and friends and supporters who are still reeling from this injustice. Stand in solidarity with the Tonga Ladies Association, of which Poli was the chair. And we know that Poli was also a passionate environmental rights campaigner, was present at the Paris Agreement, standing by all of our peoples there. And we also know that in a climate crisis, our LGBTQI2 spirit members of our communities are the least likely to be rescued. And so these protections also around our all of our sisters, including our ladies, our whaawhine, ira wahine, ira tāne, whānau are so important in this place. And I really appreciated also your focus and call for us to develop national action plans. We need actions to safeguard us. Even here in Aotearoa, it is a very precarious situation for human and environmental rights defenders, but in particular also for women and for children, and it's dire right across our region. So thank you very much. That was a powerful intervention. Our next speaker, who I'd like to welcome to the floor, Aigagalefili, Fepulea'i, Tapua'I. Fili is a South Auckland raised urban orator and climate activist and winner of the PCF Supreme Award for Pacific Youth Advocacy. Fili is a co-founder of Climate Change Activism Collective for the Culture, and she is a powerful Pacific and youth voice for the climate movement in Aotearoa. I'm very excited to have her with us today, and I will cede the floor to you, Fili. Tēnā koe.
Talofa lava, thank you so much. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank all the wonderful speakers that came before me. I'm very humbled and blessed to be able to give my perspective as a young woman living in the diaspora. So I come from the villages of Fepulea'i and Sungungi in Samoa, and I'm born and raised in Mangere, South Auckland. And my perspective comes out of the experience of engaging and navigating spaces where the climate conversation has been largely Eurocentric, has been largely run by white people in ways in which our youth have not been able to engage to the full extent that they should be. And so in giving that perspective, I want to talk about the protection of these young environmental human rights defenders who are just starting off in their journey and who are trying to navigate through all the intersections and all the nuances of what it means. And so the importance of being someone from the diaspora comes from a space of making sure that we are using everyone that we can, having all hands on deck, and making sure that we can do what we can to benefit the Pacific region as a whole. Living in South Auckland, to give context, South Auckland is largely low socioeconomic. It is largely condensed with a lot of systemic issues that have come out of that have come as products of colonization and systemic oppression and the constant, through history, the constant oppression of Pasifika people and our indigenous tangata whenua here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so in saying that, I'd like to also acknowledge that as indigenous people, the land, the language, our people and our customs, they are all the same. One is not held at a higher value than another, which is why all of our issues, they're not mutually exclusive. They're actually very intertwined and interlinked, which is why climate justice comes as not only environmental justice, but social justice, comes in the form of educational inequality and making things accessible and making sure that this knowledge is accessible for our rangatahi to learn and to know who they are and learn their history. In saying that, I'd like to say that self-determination of our youth, especially our young environmental human rights defenders, comes from learning our true history, and comes in decolonizing the educational systems that teach us that we are less than what we are. And I say that because in Eurocentric societies, we often see that the negative media representation has such a massive effect on the mental health of our Indigenous youth. And that is something so important to acknowledge, because it is hard for us to self-actualize and to have the self-determination we need to mobilize and do the work that needs to be done when we have so much to unlearn in the first place. And so it is important that our governments and our constitutions, and especially our educational systems, acknowledge this and do the work to undo all that hurt that has happened over centuries. And because of this, when it comes to environmental knowledge and knowledge about climate change, there's a massive misconception that it is purely scientific and that it's purely economical, when really as Indigenous people, we know that climate change has everything to do with culture, has everything to do with what we love and who we love, especially as people from the Pacific. And saying this, I believe it is important to make sure that climate change knowledge is made accessible, that it is not only said in elitist educational terms, but made to be accessible to the communities that need it most, to those who need help understanding it in the ways that which they can understand things through culture, and through ways that are made, like I say, accessible for those who are most targeted and made most vulnerable. And because climate change came with colonization, I also believe that the movement in Western countries, in Eurocentric countries, should be led by Indigenous people, and that the Indigenous voices should be at the forefront of not only the movement, but decision making on every single level up to government. And I believe this because it is hard for us to know what to do in the climate change movement when those who are most affected aren't given the proper platform or the proper voice that they need to do the change that needs to happen. And working in a lot of spaces where working in collaboration with Pākehā or white-led groups, I think that it's important to acknowledge the different levels of intersection there. Not only being someone from a low socioeconomic space, but being a youth and being, as I say, an Indigenous woman, it's important to realize that there's a lot of different nuances that our youth aren't ready to go into without the proper tools. And so it's important that we're giving them these proper tools, not only to go in there and represent for us, but to be able to pass it on to the people that they will pass it on to. And one of the massive misconceptions is that individualistic action means more than systemic change. And I say this because one of the biggest problems that I find when trying to engage with our youth here in South Auckland and here in our Indigenous spaces is that there's a big misconception that the only ways to combat climate change is through very elitist money-based solutions, going vegan, getting an electric car. But of course, that is not the case at all for our Indigenous people. And so I believe that making a strong stance and dismantling the notions that Pākehā-led tribal conversations have led our people to believe is so important. Making climate solutions less elitist and decolonizing that knowledge so that our rangatahi can be able to know themselves and to know what to do properly. I'd like to quickly end this off by just emphasizing that it is so important to center those who are most affected, and that to protect our environmental human rights defenders, it is so important for us to not only know our history, but to implement that so that our children can know our history and so that we can fight for our future. And so thank you so much.
Fili, Malo, thank you so much. Again, another powerful intervention, and you're so right. It is everything to do with what we love, who we love, how we value, how we relate, and also, you know, such an important issue to bring to light, which is access to information for our communities as well. And we've seen that, you know, there's been an abundance of climate science and plastic science, which I'm involved in through my work, that is being done to our people, not with our people and not by our people, but to our people, which we know through multiple statements that have been issued through the UN and through IUCN and through the UNEP, that is not the best practice for developing information upon which we will base our policies. And so climate science and plastic science has to be, at the very minimum, accessible to our people, but optimally done by our people and with our people as well. So, and access and benefit sharing arrangements are also highlighted by the UN, but are consistently being violated in the science networks that are at play within our Pacific region. So thank you for bringing that to light. We have about 20 minutes left for questions and answers. If anybody has one that they would like to ask, please do write it down in the chat. What I'm going to start off with now is a question for all of our panelists. You've all gone over quite powerfully this morning the main barriers for women and Indigenous environmental human rights defenders. It's very difficult to defend our climate when we ourselves are at immediate physical risk of harassment and assault. I was wondering if you could all share examples of good practice in this space, in the protection and promotion of women and Indigenous environmental human rights defenders. So some good practice examples that you're aware of in that space. Mereoni, if it's okay, I'll pass it over to you and then over to Fili also after Mereoni to answer that question of some examples of good practice in this space.
Thank you, Tina. Yep, I'm not muted. Okay, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to the rest of the speakers for their presentation. There's so many connections and linkages and shared understandings that we've spoken to. And to Catherine and Roshika for pointing out and raising the barriers that women human rights defenders are at risk of constantly. Well, the first thing that comes to mind on good practices and in my experience with mobilizing around oceans and trying to get a critical voice within decision-making spaces has been collectivism and acting in solidarity and mobilizing together. We are recognizing the increasing closing spaces of civil society, access to policy-making spaces. Our governments are becoming more and more out of reach for us people, the people that they serve. So we need to bound together and work together on these issues and share our resources and stand together in the face of those who are more dominant and pushing us back. So in the work that we do in advocating and challenging deep sea mining interest in the Pacific, there's been a great collective of Pacific civil society organizations, both at the national level and at the regional level, just coming together. You know, we Pacific people can recognize when we are being exploited, especially our environment. We have a long legacy in the region of this, you know, this narrative or this rhetoric of doing tests in the region for the betterment of mankind and the whole world and all of this, and they test with us first. And this links to our nuclear testing legacy that, you know, the impacts are still faced by many of us in the region. So when we notice that there's this rhetoric of blue economy, blue industries, blue financing, so far and so on, there are flags that pop up. And we gather our resources, we share our knowledge, our learnings from our elders about how things have been exploited previously. And coming together, we use our resources to go together to our leaders, to what Roshika said and highlighted about the regional governance body needing to take more of a stand. We're going to them together and we're saying Pacific Islanders speaking to Pacific leaders is really important and they need to hear us. So one of the best practices is mobilizing amongst ourselves, going in numbers, and that requires resources. So coming back to points that were raised by other speakers about, dedicating resources, whether that be, protections for human rights defenders in legislation and policies, or the dedication of commitment of specific spaces in decision-making spaces and dialogues for human rights defenders to come and speak. So yeah, working together, collectivism is still very key to the movement, and the Pacific does it well. The Pacific CSOs are not going anywhere. We're here to stay, and we work together really well at all levels. And it would be good to work with our governments too.
Wonderful, thank you, Mereoni. Fantastic answer to that question. Fili, did you have any points that you wanted to add to that around potentially some good practice models that you've seen?
I think very good practices for, or speaking out of personal experience, for environmental human rights defenders would be, firstly, to understand and know when what you're doing is diluting the culture or evolving the culture. And I would say that because although we have to use these Western systems to get some things done, there are spaces where our own Indigenous cultures hold more value and hold, of course, more precedent. And so I would say that it's a very good practice to not always, or to try to just reflect on yourself when the measures of what you're measuring your success is through a colonial lens, and knowing when what you're doing is not actually serving your people, but is more being influenced from a Western perspective. And so those are just a few thoughts I wanted to share.
Wonderful, thank you. Very succinct, but important and powerful response. I want to acknowledge also the powerful outcome that you've recently been able to achieve in that space, Fili. And it's unavoidable in some of these spaces that people will have to cede power and cede the occupation of the space within the climate movement that they hold, particularly people, non-Indigenous allies. And so you've been able to achieve that in a very powerful way recently in your group, Fili, and I want to acknowledge that. Roshika, did you have any points that you wanted to add to that initial question around good practice that you've seen?
Yep, I think one of the things that works really well is, for instance, right now there's discussion happening on the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights. However, we don't see women environmental human rights defenders meaningfully engaged or having access to such spaces. I think that a holistic approach in other spaces, what has really worked in terms of highlighting some of the concerns or even the advocacy of women human rights defenders has been when there's been a holistic approach taken to include human rights defenders. So concerns, challenges, and so on are shared in this space, and it results in a lot more awareness and a lot more collaboration in reaching protection mechanisms that should be in place, or in terms of ensuring accountability. So this should, National Human Rights Institution is one body for the Pacific Island countries that have one, should be included. The government, the women environmental human rights defenders, also donors and business investors, because a lot of the time, women environmental human rights defenders also don't have as access to mainstream media, don't have access to businesses and so on, as government, as UN, and as donors and other bodies and entities has. So taking that holistic approach and bringing them together, we've seen in the past works really well in terms of, fostering that collaboration to progressing on protection mechanisms.
Roshika, thank you so much. That is such an important point that you raised, because we've seen so often that the funding regimes, international funding and economic support regimes that surround our Pacific region also have significant impact upon our ability to be able to respond in that space. It's very difficult to advocate for solutions when the people who are responsible for the oppression sometimes are also the ones that hold the purse strings for our support in other areas. And so responses that address these funding regimes, the oppressive funding networks and regimes around us, some of the international financial institutions and their impact upon the issue, and of course media, the incredible influence that media has in this issue. It's really important that we take these holistic responses. So thank you so much for that response. Catherine, did you have anything that you wanted to add to the question of best practices?
Yeah, sure. Very generally, I'd just like to encourage somehow for society to cultivate new attitudes and values around how we perceive defenders. They're not antagonists, they are protagonists. If it wasn't for the work that we do and that the women and Indigenous peoples do by inconveniencing others, I think I might have said this yesterday, if we did an audit of all the wins in terms of the evolution of the justice system and law and principles, if we took all of that out of this world, our world would be a very, very different looking place, worse. So we have to see these defenders as having a valuable role in society and think about all of those fringe, outlying people over history. If it wasn't for them, and they were demonized and ridiculed at the time. But it wasn't until the consciousness of society evolved and matured that we look back and we go, oh, they actually did us a big favor. So somehow we have to, and the education system, I would say, is the way to, cultivate those different perceptions about defenders. And on that point, I'd say that we can't just leave these specialist areas of knowing about human rights, environmental rights, the work of defenders, the obligations of governments and corporations. We can't leave that to a specialist course at tertiary institutions. They must be embedded in the curriculums earlier on in school education. And one more practical thing I would say is around land rights. Of course, we have to protect Indigenous people's land rights because there's a really tight nexus between that. It's a prerequisite for sustaining manageable and sustainable use of our precious resources, territories, biodiversity. It's Indigenous peoples who have done, the backbreaking work on that. That's now widely recognized and accepted. Protect Indigenous people's land rights, and you'll get a much better outcome at the other end. Those are just a few thoughts from me. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Catherine, I'll pass it over to you first for concluding remarks, and then we'll move through to the rest of our panel members.
Kia ora, no, just to say thank you once again for allowing, first creating this space in the first place and allowing us to come together. It's often we're in our own bubbles, and it's good to be able to actually bounce off others in a dynamic group, and that's like a micro situation. The macro is also needed for the Pacific region. Just chatting with some colleagues about how do we create these networks in a more effective way so that we can share knowledge, not having to reinvent wheels, but building on the knowledge of others and spreading that knowledge out as far as possible, thinking of systems and ways to do that. That's somewhere where we have to take the next logical step and how to build and create that. I look forward to that discussion, so thank you.
Tēnā koe te tuakana. Roshika, final remarks?
Yes, just to conclude, I want to reiterate how important it is for us to continue, raising, raising awareness on the different mechanisms that can be used to be able to provide some level of protection of women environmental human rights defenders, because in the meantime, whilst we're working on more sustainable and long-term efforts, there are many, women human rights defenders, environmental human rights defenders, and specifically women environmental human rights defenders in many of our Pacific Island countries that are experiencing really adverse violations. PNG is one example, and I think that as a collective, as a group working in this area, it's so important for us to continue lobbying our government, continue lobbying UN, to do more around or to invest more resources to be able to highlight the status of women environmental human rights defenders in our region. We have a lot of information from other regions. We have a lot more research and data that has been accumulated over the years, however, not so much in our region. And there is a dire need, especially in terms of how business practices create adverse social and environmental violations. So that's my concluding remark. Thank you, everyone, for this space and for us to be able to share some of our reflections and the work we do in this area.
Thank you, Roshika. You've offered some really powerful points for us all to consider today in this space. Mereoni, if I could pass over to you for final concluding remarks.
Thank you, Tina. Vinaka to everybody. Just my final comments, similar to Roshika's. I just want to reiterate the importance of critical collective engagement from the Pacific people, from the Pacific movements. We need to make our voice heard. We need to ask the questions and challenge the status quo. Last week was the oceans, the week of oceans, celebration of World Oceans Day. There was a lot of conversations going on and not enough political conversations. What we need is a political conversation, and we need to make sure that that conversation is not reserved for politicians only. It's about us. It's a people's conversation, and we have to insert ourselves and assert ourselves in that space. We need to be in the conversations that are happening, that matters to us and is about us. I'm all for, just one other final point is about the mechanisms that are available to human rights defenders. The United Nations is a key site, a key platform for where these mechanisms call home. And we need more access to this kind of mechanisms. The UN needs to be accessible to the people. The UN is supposed to be about holding governments and powers to account, and it's people who do that. So these mechanisms have to be made more accessible, more resourced, so that people that can access them, civil society groups, we can hold our governments and the governments of big countries who are acting within our region to account. So that's a challenge.
Thank you, Mereoni. Wonderful. Thank you very much again, Mereoni, for your input today. And Fili, over to you for final remarks, and then I will wrap us up.
Just to tautoko what everyone has said, I would just like to emphasize that it is in the whole world's best interest that the Pacific as a region is protected. Like Tina has said, it is one lung of our planet that we have here. And like it is said in the Pacific Climate Warriors, if one island sinks, every country after that follows. And so I'd like just to acknowledge that it is massive work to do, but it is so crucial and is so necessary. And I'd like to thank you for having this space and for letting us talk here. And I look forward to more discussions that will come out of this. Thank you.
Thank you again, Fili. And thank you to all of our panelists and to